cabin was supposed to be a quiet escape. I needed the time away, and the idea of being alone in the woods for a few days felt like the perfect reset. I rented a small place deep in the mountains, far from town, with nothing but trees and a lake nearby. No neighbors, no roads within miles, and no cell service. Just silence. The drive there was long, twisting through miles of empty forest roads. The last stretch was just a dirt path, barely wide enough for my car. The trees were dense, and the branches hung low. It felt like I was driving into a different world. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set. It was small, made of dark wood, with a porch that wrapped around the front. The lake was about 50 yards away, still and quiet, reflecting the darkening sky. I parked, grabbed my bag, and headed inside. The place was basic but comfortable. A single room setup with a small kitchen, a bed in the corner, and a wood stove for heat. There was a bathroom, but no shower, just a sink and a toilet. The air smelled like old wood and dust. There was a heavy stillness, like the place had been untouched for a long time. I unpacked, started a fire in the stove, and sat down with a book, letting the quiet settle in. That first night, I woke up to a sound outside. It was soft, like something moving through the trees. I sat up, listening. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I lay there for a long time, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I walked down to the lake. The water was dark and still, with a thin mist floating over the surface. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cold air, trying to shake the strange feeling from the night before. When I turned back to the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Footprints. They weren't mine. They were fresh, leading from the tree line to the porch. Barefoot. The prints were uneven, as if whoever left them was limping or dragging one foot. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing. Maybe someone had been passing through? Maybe they were lost? But why barefoot? And why come all the way to my cabin, then leave? I followed them to the edge of the trees, but they disappeared into the undergrowth. The woods were thick, and I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. My skin crawled. I turned back to the cabin, locking the door behind me. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. I stayed inside, reading, trying to ignore the growing tension in my gut. The sun set early, and the cabin felt even smaller in the darkness. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan. I tried to sleep, but every sound made my heart jump. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. That same soft movement outside. I lay still, barely breathing. The footsteps were slow, shuffling, moving around the cabin. I could hear the leaves crunching under them. Then, a soft tap on the window. Not a knock, just a light, deliberate touch. I sat up, my chest tightening. The fire had died completely. The room was dark. I could just make out the window, but I couldn't see anything outside. I reached for my flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the glass. Nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but I knew better. I stayed awake the rest of the night, my back against the wall, listening. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. This wasn't normal. I packed my bag, threw everything into the car, and started the engine. It sputtered but didn't turn over. I tried again. Nothing. My stomach sank. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know what I was looking for. I wasn't a mechanic. I only knew that the car had been fine when I got here. Panic started to creep in. No cell service. No way to call for help. The nearest town was miles away. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. I had food, I had water. I could wait until morning and hike to the main road. I just had to make it through one more night. That day, I stayed inside, listening to every sound, jumping at every creak. The sun started to set, and I braced myself. The wind howled through the trees, making the cabin groan. The fire crackled, casting shifting shadows on the walls. I sat with my back to the wall, my flashlight in my lap. Then the footsteps came again. Slow, dragging, closer this time. I gripped the flashlight, my hands shaking. The sound stopped right outside the door. My breath caught. The door handle rattled, just once. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed. Then, from the window, a single tap. My heart pounded. I aimed the flashlight, but the beam only showed the empty porch. I stayed like that for hours, frozen in place, waiting. The sounds didn't come again. At first light, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't care about the car anymore. I walked, fast and steady, refusing to look back. The forest felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. It took hours, but I finally reached the main road. A truck passed and I waved it down. The driver, an older man, looked at me like he knew, like I wasn't the first. He didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. I didn't argue. As we pulled away, I looked back one last time. The trees swayed in the wind, the cabin barely visible through the branches. I never went back, never even checked what happened to my car. I left it all there, whatever was waiting in those woods, whatever had been watching me. Some places aren't meant to be visited. Some doors aren't meant to be opened. And some things, once they know you're there, don't let you leave so easily. The cabin was deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest road. I found it listed online, a cheap, off-grid rental for a long weekend. The pictures showed a rustic one-room structure, nothing fancy, but it had a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a big porch that overlooked the trees. It seemed perfect, quiet, peaceful, place to reset. The drive out there took longer than I expected. The gravel road turned to dirt, the trees grew thicker, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the hills. There was no cell service. That was part of the appeal, really, to be alone without distractions, just the sound of the wind and the trees. The key was in a metal lockbox on the porch. The cabin smelled like wood and dust when I stepped inside. There was a bed against the far wall, a small wooden table, a few mismatched chairs. A wood-burning stove sat in the corner, a stack of logs beside it. I checked the kitchen, an old gas stove, a sink, a few cabinets stocked with the basics. Everything looked just like the photos. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and sat on the porch as the last bit of daylight disappeared. The silence out there was different from what I was used to. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, no planes overhead. Just the wind moving through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the distance. That first night, I slept fine. The second night, not so much. It started with small things. The feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew I was. The sensation of movement outside, like someone or something was shifting in the trees. But every time I looked, there was nothing there. The third night, I heard footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I listened. The footsteps circled once, then stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat. Morning came, and I told myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. I left it at that. But that night, the footsteps came back. Louder, closer. This time, they stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, listening. Then I heard something scratch against the wood. A single, slow scrape. Then another. I grabbed the only weapon I had, a heavy flashlight, and crept toward the door. The scraping sound stopped. I stood there waiting, but whoever or whatever had been outside was gone. I barely slept after that. The next day, I found something near the tree line. Footprints, bare feet, pressed deep into the mud. They were fresh. I packed my things right then. I didn't care that I had another night left on my rental. I was leaving before dark, but as I loaded my bag into the car, I saw something on the porch. A small, hand-carved wooden figure. A crude little thing just a few inches tall, shaped like a person. I hadn't seen it there before. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to know what it meant. I got in the car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I never found out who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't supposed to be there, and whoever left that figure behind wanted me to know it. I never wanted to go to that cabin. I should have trusted my gut. The moment I pulled up to it, deep in the woods, miles away from anyone, I knew something felt off. It was my brother's idea. He swore this old place was perfect for a quiet weekend. A break from everything. No cell service, no distractions, he said. Just us and nature. He couldn't make it, though. A last-minute work thing. But I had already made the drive, stocked up on food, and figured I might as well stay. The first night was fine. The air was crisp, and the stars looked clearer than I'd ever seen them. I built a fire, cooked a decent meal, and read for a bit before heading inside. The cabin was old, the floors creaked, and the wind made strange sounds against the walls, but nothing that really bothered me. I slept fine. The second night was different. I had spent the day hiking, following an overgrown trail that led nowhere. It was exhausting, and by the time I got back, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. I went inside, started a fire in the small wood stove, and made dinner. The quiet was thick, heavier than before, the kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the silence playing tricks on me. Around midnight, I heard something, a sharp sound, like footsteps on the porch. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I shook it off and went back to my book, but a few minutes later, there it was again, a deliberate, heavy step on the wooden planks outside. I stood up slowly, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. Through the window, the porch was empty. I opened the door just enough to shine the light outside. Nothing but trees and darkness. My own breathing was too loud. I forced a laugh at myself, muttered something about raccoons, and locked the door. But sleep didn't come easy. I lay awake for hours, listening. The forest has a way of making every small sound feel bigger, closer. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Things I would normally ignore now made my pulse jump. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. The porch. A slow, dragging step this time. Then another. The wooden boards creaked under something heavy. I held my breath, barely blinking, staring at the dark outline of the door. The sound stopped. Silence stretched, thick and unmoving. And then, a faint scratching, right at the door. I didn't move, couldn't. Every muscle in my body locked tight. My mind raced for an explanation, but nothing felt right. No animal scratches like that. No animal moves like that. I wanted to check the window, but I couldn't make myself get up. What if whatever was out there saw me? I stayed in bed, gripping the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, I must have. The morning light made everything feel stupid. I told myself it was probably just a raccoon or something messing around, but I couldn't shake the feeling. Something was wrong. I stepped onto the porch, my breath visible in the cold air. My stomach turned. The wood was marked with deep, uneven scratches, right in front of the door. The kind that didn't come from claws. The kind that looked more like someone had dragged something sharp back and forth. I told myself it was an animal. What else could it be? But I felt it then, something I had never felt before. The sense that I was being watched. I spent the whole day convincing myself I was imagining things. I walked around the cabin, checked the woods nearby, looked for tracks. I found nothing. By evening, I was exhausted. I told myself I'd leave in the morning. I just had to get through one more night. I locked every window, double-checked the doors, and kept the flashlight next to me in bed. I forced myself to stay calm. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up to something worse than before. Not just sounds, not just scratching, breathing, right outside my window. Slow, steady breaths, too heavy for an animal, too controlled. My blood turned ice cold. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe myself. Then tap. A soft, deliberate tap against the glass. Not testing it. Not random. A signal. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see. I didn't want to know what was standing there, just inches from me, separated by thin glass. Another tap, then silence. I don't know how long I lay there, too afraid to move. Eventually, the night stretched on, and the first light of dawn crept through the trees. I stayed in bed until I was sure it was morning. Then, heart pounding, I forced myself to look at the window. Nothing. No marks, no footprints. Just the trees and the early morning mist. I didn't pack. I didn't even eat. I grabbed my keys, got in the car, and left without looking back. I told my brother I'd never go back to that cabin. He laughed, said I let my imagination get to me. Maybe I did. Maybe there was nothing there. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear it in my head. That slow, careful breathing just beyond the glass. The kind that lets you know you were never really alone. I don't know if writing this will help, but I need to put it all down somewhere. Maybe if I see the words on a screen, it'll make sense, or at least help me move on. A few weeks ago, I rented a cabin deep in the woods. I wanted to get away from everything: work, people, noise. I had been feeling overwhelmed, and the idea of complete isolation sounded like exactly what I needed. No cell service, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. The drive took longer than expected. The roads narrowed the further I went, winding through dense forest with no signs of life. The last 30 minutes were on a dirt road filled with potholes, the kind that make you feel like your car is about to rattle apart. My GPS lost signal, but I had written down the directions beforehand. I wasn't worried. The cabin was small and old but well kept. It sat in a clearing, surrounded by towering trees. A narrow path led to a lake, which I could just barely see through the trees. The air was crisp, cool, and smelled of pine. It should have been peaceful. But the moment I stepped out of my car, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious. No strange noises, no eerie sights, just an unsettling feeling, like stepping into a place where I wasn't supposed to be. I ignored it. I was alone in the woods, after all. It made sense that it would take a moment to adjust. The cabin had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom with a creaky wooden bed. There was a fireplace, but I had brought an electric heater in case I didn't feel like dealing with firewood. A few oil lamps sat on a shelf, next to a stack of books left behind by previous visitors. I settled in quickly. I stacked my food in the tiny fridge, unrolled my sleeping bag onto the bed, and spent some time sitting on the porch, listening to the wind rustling the leaves. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet. No birds, no animals, just the wind. That first night, I slept poorly. I kept waking up, heart pounding for no reason. Every time I opened my eyes, I had the overwhelming sense that something was in the room with me, but I never saw anything. It was just a feeling heavy in the air. In the morning, I shook it off. I wasn't used to sleeping in complete silence, that was all. Back home, there were always cars passing by, neighbors talking, the hum of city life. Here, the silence was absolute. It would take time to adjust. I spent most of the day exploring. I followed the path to the lake, skipped rocks, took in the view. The water was still, almost too still. It reflected the trees like a mirror, without a single ripple. Even when I threw a rock, the water settled too quickly, like something was off about it. I didn't stay long. On my way back, I found something strange. A small pile of rocks, stacked carefully in a clearing just off the path. 5 stones, balanced on top of each other. They looked deliberate, placed, not fallen. I had heard of people leaving stacked stones as markers or signs, but this was deep in the woods. Who else would be out here? The nearest town was over an hour away, and I hadn't seen another car on the way in. That night, the unease returned, stronger than before. As I lay in bed, I kept hearing noises outside, soft, shuffling movements, like footsteps in the leaves. But when I looked out the window, there was nothing, just darkness. Then, just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a single deliberate knock on the cabin wall. I sat up, heart hammering. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer brushing against the wood. But then it happened again. A slow, steady knock. 3 times. I held my breath, listening. Nothing followed. No retreating footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just silence. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my flashlight in my hand, scanning the room, waiting for something, anything, to explain what I had heard. Morning took forever to come. I should have left then, packed up my things, gotten in my car, and driven away. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that isolation was getting to me. The 3rd night was worse. I locked the door, bolted the windows, made sure everything was secured. I even kept my flashlight within arm's reach. But it didn't help. At some point in the night, I woke up gasping. Not because of a noise, not because of a nightmare, but because I couldn't breathe. Something heavy was on my chest. I couldn't see it, couldn't move, couldn't even make a sound. I tried to push it off, but my arms wouldn't respond. My whole body was frozen. And then, just as suddenly as it came, the pressure lifted. My body snapped free, and I bolted upright, sucking in deep, ragged breaths. My hands were shaking. My shirt was damp with sweat. I reached for my flashlight and shined it around the room. Nothing, but the door was unlocked. The deadbolt, which I had secured before bed, was turned back. That was enough. I packed my things in record time, tossing everything into my duffel bag without caring if it was folded or neat. My hands were trembling so badly that I struggled to get my boots on. The whole time, I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to swing open on its own. I ran to my car and turned the key. The engine sputtered. No, not now. Not here. I turned the key again. The engine groaned but didn't start. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to stay calm. I had checked the battery when I arrived. Should have been fine. A noise from the trees. I snapped my head up. The woods were dark, but I swore I saw movement. A shadow shifting between the trees, too tall to be an animal. I turned the key one last time, and the engine roared to life. I slammed the gas and tore out of there, bouncing down the dirt road, potholes be damned. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on paved roads, back in cell-service range. When I finally pulled over at a gas station, I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. But when I opened my photos, my stomach turned to ice. There was a picture, one I hadn't taken, picture of me, asleep in the cabin. It was late October when my uncle called, asking if I could go check on the family cabin. He said a storm had passed through the area, and he wanted to make sure there wasn't any serious damage. My uncle was getting older, and the drive up the winding mountain roads wasn't as easy for him anymore. I had a few days off work, so I said sure. It sounded like an easy enough job. Drive up, check for damage, and be back home by evening. The cabin was about 3 hours from my house, deep in the woods. It wasn't a fancy place, just a simple wooden structure my grandfather had built decades ago. No running water, no electricity, just a fireplace, some old furniture, and the smell of damp wood. It had been years since I'd last been there, but I still remembered the feeling of isolation. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just trees and silence. The drive up was uneventful. The road turned from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. Leaves crunched under my tires as I made my way up the familiar path. The air was cool, and the sky was a dull gray, the kind that makes it feel like the sun is always about to set. The storm had left its mark. Branches scattered across the road, mud puddles deep enough to swallow a tire, but nothing too serious. When I pulled up to the cabin, everything looked fine at first. The roof was still intact, the walls still standing. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. The front door was slightly open, not enough to swing in the wind, just cracked. I stopped, staring at it. I was sure my uncle would have locked up last time he was here. The door was heavy, old wood that didn't move on its own. I told myself the wind must have pushed it open. Maybe the lock was loose. Still, something felt off. I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking under my weight. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning. The inside was just as I remembered, dim, dusty, the faint smell of pine. Everything was in its place. The small kitchen area to the left, the worn-out couch by the fireplace, the single bed against the wall. But something was different. Took me a moment to realize what it was. There were footprints on the dusty floor. They weren't mine. I had just stepped inside, my own prints fresh and sharp. But these were older, smudged, and they didn't lead back outside. I felt my heartbeat pick up. I told myself it could have been my uncle. Maybe he had come up after the storm and forgotten to tell me. But why wouldn't he mention it? And why would he leave the door open? I walked further in, my boots echoing on the wooden floor. The air inside was cold, colder than it should have been. I checked the small storage closet, then the tiny bathroom, nothing. Everything was where it should be, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off. I had a job to do. I went outside and circled the cabin, checking the walls, the windows. A few shingles had come loose, and a tree branch had fallen near the back, but nothing major. I took some pictures for my uncle and made my way back to the porch. That's when I saw it. On the ground, near the steps, was something small and black. I bent down, my breath catching in my throat. It was a knife, a hunting knife. The blade was buried in the dirt, the handle sticking up, like someone had dropped it in a hurry. It wasn't old or rusty. It looked new. I stood up quickly, my eyes scanning the trees, my ears strained for any sound, anything. But the woods were silent, too silent. I told myself it was nothing. Someone must have lost it, maybe a hunter passing through. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my things and went inside, locking the door behind me. The sun was starting to set, and the idea of driving down those dark mountain roads wasn't appealing. I told myself I'd stay the night, leave first thing in the morning. I'd done it before, back when I was younger. I'd be fine. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace, its crackling the only sound in the cabin. I heated up a can of soup on the small propane stove my uncle kept in the kitchen. I ate quickly, my eyes flicking to the door every few minutes. The feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Night fell fast. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the windows. I sat on the couch, staring at the flames, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, a thud, somewhere outside. I sat up, heart hammering. I waited, straining to hear past the wind. For a moment, there was nothing. Then another thud, closer this time. I stood, moving slowly to the window. The darkness outside was thick, the trees swaying in the wind. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there. Then the doorknob rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I grabbed the fireplace poker, gripping it tight. My mind raced. Who was out here? Why? The nearest town was miles away. No one just passed through these woods. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the rattling stopped. Silence. I stood frozen, listening. The wind howled, the fire crackled, but nothing else. Minutes passed. My muscles burned from standing so still. Then, I heard it, footsteps moving away from the cabin. Slow, deliberate. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair by the fire, poker in hand, waiting. The footsteps never returned. But I didn't let my guard down. At first light, I grabbed my bag and left. I didn't check outside. I didn't stop to look at the trees. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove. When I reached town, I called my uncle. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he sighed and said, "That's why I don't go up there anymore." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't want to know. I never went back. I always liked being alone in the woods. The quiet, the way the trees swallowed up the sound of the outside world. The feeling that I was truly away from everything. It wasn't about running from people. I just felt more at peace in nature. So, when I found an old hunting cabin for rent in the middle of nowhere, I didn't hesitate. It was deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, a good 20 miles from the nearest town. The owner, some guy named Henry, told me it wasn't much, just a simple wooden cabin with a fireplace, a hand pump for water, and an outhouse a few steps away. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted solitude. The drive out was long, winding, and full of potholes that rattled my old truck's suspension. The further I got from the highway, the rougher the roads became. I passed nothing but trees, occasional hunting signs, and a few old, rotting cabins that looked abandoned. The last stretch was a dirt path barely wide enough for my truck, and when I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I knew I was in the middle of nowhere. The cabin was small, just one room with a cot against the wall, a wood-burning stove, a rickety old table, and a single chair. There was a pile of chopped firewood stacked neatly beside the door, which I was grateful for. I hadn't thought that far ahead. The windows were small, and one had a crack running through the middle. The whole place smelled like damp wood and old smoke. It wasn't much, but it was mine for the next few weeks. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unloaded my food supplies, set up my sleeping bag on the cot, and made sure the wood stove worked. By the time night rolled in, I had a small fire going, the kind that barely flickered but gave enough heat to keep the cold at bay. I ate a can of chili straight from the pot and listened to the quiet outside. No cars, no people, just the wind through the trees. That first night, I slept well. The kind of deep sleep you only get when you're away from everything. But the second night was different. I woke up in the middle of the night. Not to a noise, not to anything obvious. Just woke up, like something had tugged me out of sleep. I sat up, listening. The fire had died down to embers, and the room was filled with shadows that stretched and flickered with every tiny movement of light. I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch shifting. But then I realized it was too rhythmic for that. It was slow, steady crunching, like footsteps on frozen ground. I held my breath. The sound wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere beyond the tree line, just past the reach of the firelight. A bear, I told myself, or a deer, but I knew what those sounded like. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between an animal moving and a person walking. I sat there for what felt like an hour, listening. The sound didn't get closer, didn't fade away, just stayed at that same distance, moving, stopping, moving again. Eventually, it stopped completely. I waited, heart pounding, straining my ears. Nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped outside, expecting to see tracks. Maybe I'd prove to myself it was just a deer, but the ground was undisturbed. No prints, no signs of anything having been there at all. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I had dreamed it. Maybe it had been the wind playing tricks on me. I wasn't about to let a little paranoia ruin my time alone. I spent the day hiking, chopping some wood, and fishing in a small river about a mile away. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping behind the trees, and I was tired. That night, I locked the door. I hadn't the night before, but now it felt necessary. I stoked the fire a little bigger, let the warmth settle in, and lay down. I woke up to the sound of breathing, not my own. It was faint, just beyond the door. Slow, measured breaths. My chest tightened. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then a soft, slow creak of wood, the sound of weight shifting on the porch. I wanted to move, to get up, to do something, but fear held me down. I had no phone service out here, no way to call for help. I was alone. Eventually, the breathing stopped. I waited, gripping the knife, staring at the door, waiting for it to move. It never did. By morning, I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. The fear felt real, but there were no footprints outside, no signs that anyone had been there. I told myself I was just on edge, that my mind was playing tricks. I lasted one more night. The last night, I made sure to lock the door again. I even wedged a chair under the handle just in case. I stoked the fire big enough that the light reached every corner of the room. At some point in the night, I woke up again. I didn't hear anything at first, just the crackle of the fire, the sound of my own breathing. Then the door handle turned. I froze. It wasn't a gust of wind, it was deliberate, slow, testing. The chair under the handle held, but the handle kept moving. I sat up, knife in hand, staring at the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. The handle stopped moving. Silence. Then a single knock. Light, almost playful. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The knock came again. Then silence. I stayed awake until dawn. When the light finally filtered in through the cracked window, I packed my things. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw everything into my truck and got the hell out of there. I never looked back. I don't know who was out there. Maybe it was some lunatic living in the woods. Maybe it was just some hunter messing around. I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is that I will never go that deep into the woods alone again. I don't know why I thought a weekend alone in the woods would be a good idea. Maybe it was the stress of work, the endless notifications, the feeling that I hadn't had a moment to myself in months. I found the listing for the cabin online, cheap, isolated, and simple. No Wi-Fi, no distractions. That was the selling point. It seemed perfect. The drive took longer than I expected. The cabin was deep in the forest, past a winding dirt road that was barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in close, their bare branches scratching at the sky. It was early November, the air damp and cold. The last town I passed through was a good 30 miles back, just a cluster of gas stations and a single grocery store where I grabbed enough supplies for the weekend. By the time I arrived, the sun was already low, dipping behind the trees. The cabin was smaller than I pictured, just a single room with a tiny bathroom attached. Wood-paneled walls, a simple bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a wood stove in the corner. No TV, no radio, just silence. I locked the door behind me, even though I doubted anyone was out here. The listing mentioned there was no cell service, and that was no lie. My phone was useless, only good for telling me the time. I unpacked quickly, just a duffel bag of clothes and some groceries, then lit a fire in the stove. The first night was fine. Unnerving, but fine. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. Every sound felt amplified. The crackling fire, the wind pressing against the cabin, my own breathing. I forced myself to read for a while, made a simple dinner, then crawled into bed early. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. A rustling, like footsteps in the leaves. I held my breath, listening. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe. Raccoons. But then I heard it again. Closer. More deliberate. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. I reached for my phone out of habit, but of course, there was nothing I could do with it. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like an hour. The sound didn't come back. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. The woods are full of noises. I was just on edge. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. The ground was damp from the night's frost, the leaves stiff under my boots. I didn't see any tracks, no signs that anything had been outside my cabin. I shook it off. Just my imagination. The second night was worse. I was sitting at the table, eating dinner by lantern light when I heard it again. Closer this time, not just rustling, but something moving through the trees. A steady, careful movement, not an animal. I put my fork down, listening. Then, something knocked against the side of the cabin. Just once. A dull, heavy thud. I stopped breathing. My hands were shaking. It was probably a branch. It had to be, but my body knew better. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the floor. The fire was still burning, but I felt cold. I moved to the window, pressing myself against the wall beside it, just out of sight. Silence. Then, another knock. I don't know how long I stood there, waiting. I wanted to look outside, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Finally, I forced myself to inch toward the window, just enough to peek. Nothing, just the trees, barely visible in the darkness. my own reflection staring back at me in the glass. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going, sat in bed with my back against the wall, and watched the door. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag in minutes, shoving everything inside without caring about the mess. I had planned to stay until Sunday, but I didn't care. Something felt wrong. When I stepped outside, the morning light barely touched the forest floor. The air was heavy, the silence unnatural. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine, leading from the trees to my cabin, and then circling it. My stomach dropped. I ran to my car, fumbling for the keys, my breath coming too fast. I nearly dropped them trying to unlock the door. Then I saw it, near the tree-line, a figure, standing just far enough back that I couldn't see the face. Still, watching, I didn't wait. I threw myself into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel spun beneath my tires as I turned onto the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. I didn't look back. The drive felt endless. Every shadow between the trees felt like someone standing there. My pulse didn't slow until I hit pavement again, until I saw the first gas station, the first other car. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I never told anyone. What would I even say? There was no proof, nothing concrete, just my own fear. But I know what I saw. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and they weren't just passing through.